Hey everyone, and welcome to the latest exciting episode of OPG Live. And we've got a lot of great things to talk about today. I just got back from an epic photo adventure in Greenland. I'm professional photographer Ian Plant.
I'm Leah Zahner.
And welcome to OPG Live. I've already said that.
We can welcome. We're a very welcoming crew here.
Lots of welcomes for everyone. I'm welcoming everyone who's watching individually. So we've got several hundred people. This is going to take a while.
Oh, boy. I'll start reading them off, maybe. No, while we're here, and I have you here, we are going to tease a little story. I'm pretty sure we're going to hear something about a drone later.
Well, I think you're going to hear a lot of little somethings about a drone. But what I think you're driving at is you want to know about the drone attack.
A drone attack.
Yes, but no, we're going to wait a little bit later.
We're going to have to save it for later.
Well, yeah, because we want to go through all the boring stuff first, and then we'll talk about the drone attack.
That's right. So that's the hook to keep you in. Until then, a couple little things to keep in mind as you're enjoying this Q&A section. We are sponsored by Tamron today. And you'll notice on your screen that there is a free digital download that you can click on. It's 7 ways to immediately improve your photography. It's by photographer David Johnston. And that's going to cover construction, composition techniques, your gear, even the weather. So if you click the link in the description or in the banner below the video, you can go ahead and get that free download and get started. And also, if you're popping in any of your questions, you're going to look at that question chat box right below the video. So you can scroll down and add in whatever questions you have. I'll hop in where it's appropriate and we'll get through them.
All right, fantastic. Well, so as I said, I just got back from Greenland, which is a pretty amazing place. Those of you who know a little bit about Greenland probably know that it really isn't that green. They should have called Greenland Iceland, and they should have called Iceland Greenland, because Iceland is a lot greener than Greenland is. And Greenland is like 75% covered with ice. And it's really amazing when you're up above Greenland, like flying 30,000 feet above the air in a jet airliner looking down. You just see glaciers as far as the eye can see. So it's really amazing. And all of that ice is like a giant river of ice that eventually makes its way to the ocean. And then the ice calves off the glacier and it lands in the narrow fjords that surround Greenland's coastline. And there the icebergs will get stuck because they're too big and there's too much ice in the fjords. So it may take anywhere from like 5 or 10 years or even longer for the ice to melt enough so it could actually get out from the fjord. And even then, the icebergs are still massive. And once they've reached the open sea, they just keep on sailing until they hit Canada or until they melt. And one or the other will happen. For years, I've been thinking of going to Labrador and Newfoundland in Canada to photograph the icebergs. But then I got an invitation to go with a photo colleague of mine, Erez Marome, who has appeared on this show previously, to join him up there. And I said, well, I could go photograph a few scraggly looking icebergs that make their way to Newfoundland, or I can go directly to the source. So that's what I did. I went directly to the source in Greenland to photograph the icebergs there. And it was an awesome adventure. We got really lucky with the conditions. We had lots of ice, probably higher than average, the amount of ice that was floating around there. It's been a kind of a warm summer. So a lot of the bergs were just breaking off and just choking the fjords with icebergs. And there was beautiful weather. And the best way to see and photograph the icebergs is to get out on the water where the icebergs are. So we hired a boat and we were out photographing the icebergs, and we could use the boat to circle, we used the boat to find the really interesting icebergs. And then we could circle around the berg and find the best position to make our photographs. And then we took it to the next level because there's only so many positions, perspectives you can get when you're shooting from the boat. But we would launch our drones from the boat, and that opened up just an infinite number of positions and perspectives and compositions. So it really increased our flexibility to be able to photograph with the drones from the air instead of doing all our photography from the boat. But there were a lot of challenges, as you can imagine, launching and landing drones from a small motorboat. And it took us a while to really figure out how to do it. On top of those complications, Greenland is also kind of infamous for messing with drones and for the radio signals that pass between the drone and the remote controller. So the ice itself seems to interfere with the communications. And there's a lot of iron that is in the rock that makes up Greenland, and that messes with the GPS. So a lot of times you end up with a lack of communication, or the drone not really knowing where it is, which can make it kind of difficult to navigate. And of course, you're in a boat which is drifting or maybe moving around to avoid icebergs while you're flying the drone. So you can't just press the return to home button and expect the drone to come back to the right place. There's a lot of different complications. So as a result, we had a lot of drone mishaps. I think they can be properly characterized as epic drone fails. And one of the most exciting mishaps I'm going to talk about at the end of my little slideshow that I'm going to show you now. But probably the worst, close to the worst mishap, is that both Aras and I were flying, and we couldn't find the boat. We were in this bay that was just choked with icebergs, and it was a white boat in a bay full of white icebergs, and it was kind of foggy out that day. So we're flying around, and as our battery power is getting down, we start looking for the boat, and we couldn't find the boat because every iceberg looked like the boat. And so we're both freaking out. I was flying my drone back and forth. I thought I was going to crash in the ocean. I was down to 3% battery on my drone when I finally spotted the boat, and I managed to zoom it back and land it in time before the battery died. Now, it was showing 0% battery on my drone for about 2 or 3 minutes before I actually landed it. Aras got down to about 3% battery power, and by then he hadn't found the boat, so he just landed on an iceberg. And then we used the Find My Drone GPS to take the boat to that iceberg, and it was a flat, relatively large iceberg. It was seemingly stable enough. So Aras hopped off the boat, ran over, grabbed his drone, and then came back on the boat. Yeah, it's a little scary. I'm like, icebergs are a little unpredictable, because you probably heard the expression tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
Well, so basically most of the iceberg is underneath the water, but that part that's underneath in the water is constantly being eroded and melting, and eventually what'll happen is that bottom part will lose enough mass that the top part is heavy enough to tip the whole thing over. And when this happens, it's a sudden, violent event, and these icebergs are enormous a lot of the time. So when they flip over, it can be catastrophic to anything that's within a quarter mile of them. So that's something that you constantly got to be worried about. That's why the boats never get that close to the icebergs, especially the bigger ones, because it's an infrequent event, but when it does happen, it's really scary and can create a lot of risk. So Aras had to dash out as quickly as possible. He was on a relatively small iceberg that was pretty flat, so it probably didn't have a lot of mass on the bottom. It was probably pretty close to breaking up and melting completely. Maybe like a few more days or weeks, it would have been something that would have been unsafe to walk on. But it was safe enough for him to just dash out really quick, grab his drone. Not something I would recommend. This falls into the category of don't do this at home, children. Do not try this sort of thing. But as crazy as that was, I had an even worse drone mishap later on, but we'll get to that later. First, let's go into the photos. And do we have any questions so far?
We have a couple,
okay,
but none of them are too specific to where we're starting, so we can hang on to them
Sure.
and let you get started on your slideshow.
Let me just dive right in. So here is an example of the kind of icebergs we were looking for. We were looking for really interesting icebergs that had a really photogenic shape that would be good for photography. Just because something's beautiful doesn't mean that it's photogenic. And so a lot of times we were looking for icebergs with tall turrets or towers, or that kind of looked like a castle structure. But our favorite type of iceberg to photograph was the icebergs that had arches. And so this arch, as you can see, it's very narrow at the top. This berg is probably ready to split in half at the arch. So these sorts of things are kind of ephemeral, and a lot of times we'd be photographing the arches and we'd see ice, like large chunks, several tons of ice just come falling down off the arch. So these things are constantly eroding, which makes it dangerous to boating through the arch, for example, would just be a suicide mission. But sending your drone through the arch is a great idea, because no one cares if the drone dies. Well, I mean, I don't want to just lose my drone, but it's a lot better for the drone to go on a suicide mission than for me to go on a suicide mission. As you'll find out later, the drone was not happy with this and did seek revenge at the very end. But in the meantime, the drone was great for getting some really interesting positions. It allowed me to really maximize and optimize my compositional opportunities. So here I was able to select a position with my drone where there was some light on the drone. We were there during the midnight sun. Like, the sun did set while we were there, but it never got dark. and the sun was just below the horizon. And I think the first few days we were there, it was 24 hours of daylight. So it's pretty stunning, being up there and being able to sail around midnight for like 4 or 5 hours and have brilliant, beautiful light the whole time. So we'd have those magic hour, like the golden hour light, sunrise and sunset light, the golden light, and then we'd also have that twilight glow. Often there'd be light in the clouds the entire evening. So, if you had some really great colorful clouds, all you had to do was find icebergs. You could photograph one iceberg with some great light in the clouds and then move on to the next one. So it was a very productive trip. So for this particular shot, what I did is I selected a position that allowed me to get some light on the front of the iceberg to see the arch and to get some of those colorful lit clouds in the background. And this is something I could not have really done if I was photographing from the boat. The drone allowed me to get high enough so that I could pull the clouds up so you can see them behind the iceberg. Here's another example. This is looking down at a iceberg. This is actually not the same iceberg. This is a different iceberg that also had an arch. And I flew up with my drone, and this is actually a vertical pan of 3 images that I stitched together. The drone camera is only affixed in a horizontal format, so if you want to get a vertical image, you either need to crop or you need to pan the image and then stitch the images together, which is what I did here. So it gives me a big high-resolution file, which is really nice. And this particular image shows you the aftermath of one of those collapses. Several tons of ice had fallen off, and you can see here, those are the ice flows that are drifting away from the iceberg. So often that would make some very interesting compositional opportunities. We could use those ice flows as leading lines, and we can make more interesting compositions with those elements than we could without. So we were looking for these interesting icebergs with arches, but we were also looking for arches that had some sort of recent collapse with lots of ice trailing off to make our compositions more interesting. This is another example of that. There had been a recent collapse. We saw the collapse happen, so we flew our drones out to this iceberg. This was a photograph I made in the evening twilight. It was a little bit foggy. This was the infamous night of fog where we couldn't find our boats. So this whole bay was just covered with small icebergs, and because there was really soft light, it was a little bit dark as a result that evening, so it was very, very difficult to navigate by visual cue. So this is why we had such a tough time getting our drones back. And you can see all this ice that is floating around. It may not look like it, but a lot of the bigger chunks here were boat size. So you can see why it would have been difficult to spot a boat in a sea full of this sort of stuff. And for this particular shot, I flew my drone out and I selected a composition that allowed me to use those ice flows as a leading curve into the shot. So you can see that the flow starts down in the lower right-hand corner and kind of swings over to the left and then curves back into the center of the composition, pointing to the massive iceberg with the tunnel in the background. Now that tunnel probably will become an arch at some point, but the erosion hasn't tunneled through the entire iceberg yet, so it's an arch, a future arch. I bet it's an arch right now, as a matter of fact. So I think it's time for me to go back so I can photograph this again. But who knows where this iceberg is? It might have already drifted away into the open ocean. It might be heading to Canada right now as we speak. But the drone just allowed me to get all these interesting positions. And for that particular shot, I was actually flying the drone very low, maybe about 30 feet above the water. So I was able to get down low to get the perspective that I want. It was kind of similar to a landscape shot where I might be down on my knees with my camera on my tripod only a few feet above the foreground to make the foreground shape more prominent in the composition. Same sort of thing applied here with the drone, except it's just a much bigger scale. So here is another iceberg with an arch. You can see the arch here in the background. And that it also had a recent and massive collapse of ice that was trailing out behind the iceberg. You can see this enormous, it looks like a comet's tail of ice below the iceberg. So I flew my drone above the iceberg, selected an optimal position, and once again, vertically panned the camera, taking several shots that I stitched together to get this perspective. Doing that allows me to get the precise perspective that I want for my photographs. And that's what I think is amazing about the drone for doing landscape photography, is it really opens up all of these extra possibilities for you, allowing you to get creative compositions of things that you cannot get on the land. So I find that now that I've incorporated a drone fully into my workflow, that I'm probably doing about 30 to 40% of my photography with the drone. So I'm doing a lot less land-based photography, and I'm turning to the drone whenever I feel like the land-based opportunities just aren't giving me what I want. So the drone was absolutely vital when we were in Greenland. So for the next photo, you can see here, this is actually taken from the boat with a wide-angle lens. So here's another iceberg with an arch. You can see we really liked the arches, and we were really lucky in finding them. I mean, some days we would find 3 or 4 massive, beautiful icebergs with these incredible arches. So they feature very heavily in a lot of my shots. And for this shot, the sun was rising behind the arch. And the boat, we positioned the boat so that we can see a clear view of the sunrise sky behind the arched iceberg. And then I just waited for some interesting waves in the foreground. This was kind of a tricky shot to execute because the boat was bobbing up and down considerably in the waves. So there was a lot of trial and error, a lot of really quick shooting, a lot of spray and pray, as I like to call it. I knew what I wanted. I just had to keep taking shots until all of the natural visual elements aligned in a perfect way, and I was able to get sharp images when the boat settled down quite enough. So I was taking a lot of shots to get this one image, and for me, that little bit of foam created by the moving water in the foreground becomes a foreground shape that complements the shape of the iceberg in the background and helps lead the eye deeper into the composition. Here's another drone-based photograph. This is an area in Iceland where there's this beautiful giant mountain that's on this island, and there's a small town on the island, so we took a helicopter to get out to the island. Then we went out on the boat to do some drone flying, and this was a sunrise photo. And once again, I did a vertical pan that I stitched together with my drone. So these are 3 photos that were stitched together to form a vertical-oriented photo. And I selected a position that allowed me to line up the iceberg in the foreground, the mountain, whoops, oh no, it's gone away. Here we go. The mountain in the middle ground, and then the interesting colorful sunrise cloud in the background. And there's a little bit of that ice flow trailing here as well that helps to lead the eye into the composition. So I'm always thinking about how best to line up the compositional elements, how I can use all of the visual raw material that I have available to make an interesting composition. So we had several days in a row where there was fog forming on the water, and it was low fog. So what was happening was you could just see a layer of fog, maybe about 50 to 100 feet high, and any iceberg that was taller than that would poke out from the top of the fog. And we were out at sunset to photograph this, and it was really beautiful because the fog was forming at sunset. And after a while, it would just basically cover everything. The fog would keep rising as the sun went down and things cooled down, the water cooled down. But for a while, you'd have this perfect equilibrium where the taller bergs were just poking out of the mist in the background. So this is a shot that I took of one of those taller bergs in the distance that was surrounded by mist. This was after the sun had set and there was still some color in the sky. Actually, the sun hadn't quite set yet because there was still some color in the background berg, lighting up with that last light of pink. And I used a berg that was in the foreground to frame the scene and to create a visual juxtaposition between the bottom of the photograph and the berg in the background at the top of the photograph. And here's, this is another shot. This is from the drone looking down at the bay where we have such a difficult time getting our drones back to the boat. You can just see how much ice there was. And I found this one particular interesting swirl pattern of ice. There must have been a really big collapse from one of the icebergs, and there was a lot of ice flowing around, and in the currents it was swirling. So I'm always looking for these intimate or abstract patterns whenever I get a chance. This is a photograph that I took from the boat, and we found a nice iceberg that was getting some beautiful light at sunset on it, and there had been a recent collapse. So there was all these small ice flows, these chunk of ice that were floating in the water, and as the boat passed back and forth in front of this really nicely lit iceberg, I waited for the moments where those chunks would fill in the foreground space, and they would act to lead the viewer's eye into the background of the shot. So always looking for that foreground versus background juxtaposition. That's something that's very important to my landscape photography, and it's something that I incorporate into a lot of my other photography as well. This is something that I think about when I'm doing wildlife or travel photography or anything else, because it helps create depth in the composition and it helps make the overall composition more interesting for the viewer. So it adds compositional complexity and it really helps bring your photographs up to the next level. So here's yet another arch. This was a really massive arch, and there was light from the sunset striking the front of the iceberg, and it was shining through the arch, so you see get the spotlight. There was a bit of iceberg on the other side that was lit up by the spotlight of the sunlight passing through the arch. And there had just been a collapse here, and the ice was flowing out rather quickly, so I flew my drone. As soon as I saw the collapse, I flew my drone out there because I wanted to use that ice that just collapsed as it's expanding outwards as a compositional element. So here, I waited for it to curve outwards to fill in that space for the foreground, and once I got my drone in the right position, I very quickly took a shot. The ice was moving very fast. It was moving swiftly away from the iceberg where it had fallen. It still had a lot of energy pushing it outwards, and also the current was beginning to break apart the ice and to spread it out. So I had only a short period of time to get my drone in the right position and then very quickly execute the shot before that ice, that beautiful curve, disappeared. Here's another shot that was taken from the boat, not from the drone, once again with a wide-angle lens. Had a really nice berg, had a beautiful sunset sky in the background. So there was some light on the berg, and there was some interesting color on the clouds, and the clouds had this really great shape. You know, this diagonal that's coming out of the upper left and the other lines coming out of the upper right create this radial pattern in the sky. So I wanted to have something in the foreground that would complement that shape. And there was a lot of ice flowing around, and I was using that. I took probably about 200 or 300 shots as the boat passed back and forth in front of the scene. But when I saw this gap in the ice flows, this hole, that's when I knew I had the compositional shape that would really bring the entire thing together. That gave me a shape in my foreground that complemented the shapes in the sky, tying the foreground and the background areas together, making the composition more coherent to the viewer. It also creates a really simple shape, that simple curving shape that helps just ground the composition in reality and cuts through a lot of the chaos. So it makes the shape much more simple and much more relatable for the viewer. Here's another arch. You know, we saw so many freaking arches. It was like, there's an arch here, there's an arch there, there's an arch everywhere. It was just amazing good luck. And so for this shot, the sun was setting on the other side of the iceberg, so I selected a position with my drone so that the sun was peeking through the arch hole, and I used a small aperture to get that sunburst effect, which you see right here. So you get those radiating beams of light when you stop down your lens and use a smaller aperture. The smaller the aperture you use, the more pronounced that sunburst effect will be. Here's another massive arch with this was a huge iceberg. This is probably one of the biggest icebergs I saw. And you can see, just as a sense of scale, here's the boat that I was on. As a matter of fact, let me see. If I zoom in enough, you can see that little orange dot towards the front. That's me. I look much better from afar. You know, here as an orange dot, I look pretty good, I think.
A model, even.
Yes, that's right. Well, I've got a puffy jacket on because it was really cold. And when you're in the water floating around with these icebergs, they're like giant ice cubes. So I had a puffy down jacket on. So I don't really think I look like a model. I look more like an orange version of the Michelin Man. But I'll go with that.
Perfect.
So, yeah. So that's just to give you a sense of scale, how big this iceberg really was. It was just a massive berg. There were so many of these huge icebergs. I cannot tell you enough how amazing it was to be boating and flying around with my drone these beautiful, massive icebergs. They were just incredible. And I mean, it's hard to describe how beautiful they are. I mean, you can see it kind of in the picture, but what you can't really see in the photographs is the smooth texture of a lot of these bergs. They almost look like they had been polished to a glassy finish. And in a sense they had. If they were smooth like that, that meant that that part of the berg had been underwater and that the berg had recently flipped. So, the berg hasn't really melted or eroded much in the air, so that smooth, glassy finish was the result of very gentle erosion from the water that gave it that sculpted look. It's kind of the same thing if you've ever been to a sandstone area on the coast where the sandstone is just sculpted and fluted, and it's really delicate and really quite elegant. Same thing with the ice. So it's kind of hard to describe that. And the ice would just so easily reflect the color of the sky. So it would pick up the pinks and the golden colors of the magic hours in an amazing way. So it was really a ridiculously fun adventure. Here's yet another iceberg with an arch. I mean, I think that maybe 2 of these shots were the same iceberg, but by and large, these are all separate icebergs, different arches. We were just, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. It was like photographing icebergs with arches in Disco Bay of Greenland. Just a magical adventure.
We have a couple questions that have come in.
Sure.
A couple highs. We got Jane viewing from Facebook saying, hi, Ian.
Hey, Jane.
Kim viewing says, real awesome.
Oh, well, thank you, Kim.
And then a little quick suggestion from Frank, also viewing on YouTube, says you should nickname your drone Batwing. Which is a good suggestion. And then followed up with a question, same also from Frank. For the vertical pan photos, are you able to preview the stitched image in the field, or do you have to stitch them in post-processing?
Okay, so I'm going to respond to the Batwing comment first. I think that's awesome. So my drone's name is the Angry Mosquito. But I think Batwing is a bit more apropos. And so when I flew to Greenland, I actually had to fly Iceland Air to Iceland, and then from Iceland to Copenhagen in Denmark, and then I had to fly from Copenhagen over Iceland to Greenland, and then reverse the whole thing back. It was kind of crazy, the flight path that I took. But they didn't have a really big movie selection, so I watched the Lego Batman movie. So the whole time I was flying my drone, I was making all these Lego Batman jokes. I'm Batman. And so that was actually very appropriate.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect nickname.
So when I'm so you can actually do an automatic vertical stitch with your drone with DJI drones, but it outputs it as a JPEG. You don't get a raw file. So I just do it manually instead of doing the automatic system that they have. So I have to wait until I get back, and then I stitch them together on the computer, stitch the raw files together to see what the final image is going to look like. So there's a little bit of guesswork involved, a little trial and error. I don't always get it right. That's why when I'm flying and I'm doing this vertical stitching, I'll often take a few different variations just to make sure I get it right. The biggest challenge is getting the drone in the right position so that you get the perspective that you want, and you have to kind of visualize how it's going to look when you're pointing the camera down, pointing the camera in the middle, and then pointing the camera up. So a little bit of trial and error there, but for example, this is a shot where I did a vertical stitch, and I had to try many different variations where I would move the drone closer and higher. Now, as you get closer to the object that you're photographing, it dominates more of the image space. So you're thinking, oh no, I'm too close because it's taking up almost the entire image frame. But you have to remember that you're going to be panning the camera, so you're going to have 2 more shots that feature something other than the object that's in your scene. So usually what I would do is I would get my drone over the iceberg close enough and low enough so that it pretty much filled the image space, at least from left to right. Like I didn't want it touching the edges, but pretty close filling up that image space. And then I would just use the panning motion to include more so that I didn't have just that in the scene. So you can see here that the edge of the iceberg, or at least the underwater part of the iceberg, comes pretty close to the left edge of the composition. The same thing with the right side as well. So I did actually, when I took the shot, it probably, the base shot would have looked something like this on my screen. So I would have looked at that and said, no, this is not a good photograph because I'm cutting off most of the iceberg. I had to remember that the rest of I was going to take a few other shots, one that looked like this, and then one finally that looked like the sky. Sometimes it would be 4 images. So learning how to visualize how it all comes together in the end just takes a bit of practice. Any more questions?
No, that's it for now.
Okay, fantastic. So yes, the Angry Mosquito, otherwise known as the Batwing, was responsible for this particular image that I was just showing. Just yet again, another arched iceberg. And this iceberg had these really great striations, these carved patterns that help lead the eye deeper into the composition. So they lead the eye to the arch, and then the two pointers point up to the sky, and then the sky had a nice shape that helped frame the rest of the scene. So this had some really brilliant sunset light on it, some really nice pink light, that very last light of sunset. Anywhere else, that last light of sunset would have lasted for 5 minutes. In Greenland, it lasted for about an hour. So it was pretty amazing. This is actually the same iceberg, just from a different angle. So you can see how the drone, by flying it around, I was able to identify a lot of different interesting shapes for any particular iceberg and make more than just one composition. So there was a lot of compositional opportunities. As you fly around an object or as you walk around something, it's going to change the way that object looks. It's going to change the visual relationships of multiple objects in the scene. And a good thing to do when you're doing any kind of photography, whether it's drone or on the land or anything, whether it's landscape or wildlife or anything else, is to pay attention to how your position relative to all the visual elements in the composition changes their relationship. Sometimes those visual elements will bunch up and merge, and that's not necessarily a good thing. Other times, those visual elements will spread out and separate, and that can often help your composition become more coherent and more compelling to the viewer. So these are all things that I'm constantly looking at. So the next photo here, this is another land-based photo. I was actually shooting an assignment with Tamron's new 35 to 150 millimeter lens, and I do have a video showing some of my adventures with that lens in Greenland that will be appearing on the OPG site sometime in the near future. And that was a really useful lens to have. It was a great focal length because it allowed me to zoom in tight for some of those more distant icebergs, or to go out and go wide when I was getting closer to some of the bigger icebergs. So for this particular shot, there was this, it was actually just one iceberg that's connected at the bottom. But it looks like 3 different icebergs sticking up out of the water. It's just actually one unit. And I waited for the boat to drift into a position where the 3 of these lined up to create this nice triangle of the 3 icebergs. And then I was getting that reflection in the water. And so I went wide with the lens to capture a wide angle view so I could get all of that beautiful reflection, those long vertical lines. And when you've got long vertical lines, it's usually a good idea to swing over to the portrait orientation rather than doing a landscape orientation. That gives you more room to include all of the verticality of those lines, and that gets more visual energy moving from the bottom of the image frame up into the center and to the top. And so it makes the composition a bit more compelling for the viewer. Here's another shot. This was with the drone, and this iceberg was actually really small compared to most icebergs. It was probably, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 feet long. But because I got the drone very close to it, I was able to make it look bigger in the composition. So even though it is much smaller than the mountain in the background, I was able to make both of them look pretty much the same size by changing my relative position to the foreground iceberg. So by getting in closer, I make it bigger, I make it a more compelling part of the composition, and that allows you to make things much more interesting. So always think about where your position relative to objects in the scene, how that's going to affect the size and scale of those objects, because you can make much more dramatic compositions, especially with landscape photography, by making your foreground bigger than it really is, by making it look outsized, by making it look as big or even bigger than your background. It creates a really interesting juxtaposition of visual elements from near to far, and that helps lead the eye deeper into the composition.
Now,
Okay.
Kim has another question here. Is it possible to walk on the icebergs? Probably not that small one, but aside from drone rescues, can you walk on the icebergs?
Well, you can, but you can also walk in heavy traffic or jump out of airplanes. It's not a good idea for the reasons I described earlier. These bergs can be unstable. They may look solid, but they might be just about to break apart. You often have big chunks falling off. And even worse, the most catastrophic thing is sometimes these icebergs just roll over. The bottom part melts enough in the ocean that it's no longer the biggest part of the iceberg. The top part becomes the biggest and heaviest part, and the whole thing just rolls over. And I've seen that happen before, and it's terrifying. I mean, it's like a building falling down. It really is, because these these bergs are huge. They are just many, 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 many tons of ice. Like I can't even begin to estimate how many tons of ice we're talking about here. So when something that big rolls over, it can literally, first of all, if you're on the iceberg when that happens, you're dead. There's nothing you can do because, even if you survive the rolling event itself, the bone breaking and the skull crushing that's probably going to occur when all that ice smashes you at some point, or you're smashed between the hammer and the anvil of the water and the ice. Even if you survive that, there's really no way you're going to swim your way out of that. Your chances of survival are very, very slim. And as I said, I have seen one of these events. Not only is that part catastrophic, but when a big iceberg rolls over, it sends out giant tsunami waves. So if there's a small boat anywhere within like a few hundred feet, there's a real risk of that boat being capsized. So that's why the boat I was in never got closer than maybe like a few hundred feet from the icebergs, and we were always paying very close attention to what was going on to make sure that we didn't get trapped in ice breaking off or some sort of rollover event. So, what Aris did, what I talked about earlier, as I said, one of those things, don't try this at home, kids. It was, his berg was relatively small, so the risk was a bit less, and it was also a very flat iceberg, so it was less prone to tipping over. And so he was able to do it safely. But even then, the captain of our boat was like, look, just get out there as quick as you can and get right back. Don't mess around. So it's not something I would recommend. I mean, years ago, I went sea kayaking in Glacier Bay in Alaska, and I had this fantasy in my head of like kayaking up to a glacier and getting on and setting up a shot on the iceberg and having it be a long exposure, like using a neutral density filter so that the exposure would be, 10 minutes long. And in this fantasy I concocted, because I'd have the camera on a tripod on the iceberg, the berg itself would be completely sharp in the image. But what would be unsharp, what would be blurred by the passage of time, would be everything else, all the scenery around the berg as the berg is floating through the water. And I was thinking, that would be a really cool shot. No one's done that before. Well, there's a reason why no one's done that before, because it's a really stupid thing to do. So after seeing a few bergs flip over, I was like, okay, new plan. I'm not going to do anything like that at all. So great question. Please do not attempt an iceberg landing. I think it's a really bad idea.
Possible hard pass.
Yes, yes. To quote the immortal words of Mike Myers as Dr. Evil in, I think, the third Austin Powers movie, Goldmember, that would be a no.
I like that. I like that assessment.
Yes.
All right, that's it for now. So
Okay.
we can move right along.
Okay, so I think we're at the end of my photos.
Oh, okay.
And now the story you've all been waiting for, the drone attack. So as I said, it was difficult launching and landing the drone from the boat. And so one day in the evening, I was launching my drone. I went out to the front of the boat, and I was launching from my hand. So what I did is I would push the drone up with one hand, and with the other hand on my remote control, I would engage the throttle and send it up. And it worked out pretty well for the most part. That's also how I usually would catch my drone at the end as I landed in my hand. But this particular time, a gust of wind came and pushed the drone right into my face. And so I was thinking, the drone's pretty much cheap plastic. How much damage could it really do? But I think those propeller blades are carbon fiber, and they're spinning really fast. So I learned how much damage it could, in fact, do.
No.
So this is me after the drone attack. So not only did I get hit in the face pretty bad, but also as I reached up to grab the drone, it chewed up my hand as well. And there's a lot more nerve endings in your fingers than in your chin. So I didn't feel the chin, even though the chin was all messed up, but I really felt it in my hand. So it was pretty bloody. I was bleeding all night. And the drone basically was getting its revenge. It was like, you sent me through these collapsing arches. You had me hovering like 5 feet above the ocean. I hate your guts, and I'm getting revenge. Now, I'm lucky that it wasn't a few inches higher, because it literally could have taken an eye out. You'll shoot your eye out, kid. That sort of thing. So it was a vicious, premeditated drone attack. I survived it. I am a drone attack survivor, and I'm going to form a little support group with other drone attack survivors.
You can't be the only one.
No, I'm sure.
No way.
Yeah, no. Every now and then I see people with like these really weird scars, and I'm like, oh yeah, I know he was attacked by a drone. So So there's your lesson, boys and girls. When you're launching your drone, be careful. It's a good idea to wear like a glove or like, a falconer's glove or something like that. If you're doing any hand launching or catching, be very, very careful and respect the drone. They can do a lot more damage than you realize. So it was great because I had this really ugly scar for a while, so I had an excuse for being unattractive. But now the scar's healed for the most part, and it's just back to being plain old normal ugly, which I have no excuse for. So sorry about that, guys.
We will make do.
Okay. Just look away. Look away, and it'll all be good.
You survived. All right, well, I'm going to start working my way through some questions that we have coming in. As always, just keep adding them into the chat box underneath the video. We're going to back up all the way away from some icebergs to start off with. We're going into a question from Tammy, submitted on Facebook.
Hello, Tammy from Facebook.
Yeah, black dogs are much harder to photograph.
Black dogs.
Tips? We're taking a hard swing. It's totally different.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's kind of the opposite of photographing white icebergs. So when you're photographing anything that is very dark or very bright, you're going to have some challenges. First of all, exposure. Your camera, has this meter, and a lot of times the camera manufacturers will give it these names like smart metering or evaluative zone metering, and it sounds really intelligent, but the camera is actually pretty dumb. It doesn't really know what it's doing. It doesn't know how to pick an optimal exposure. What it does is it reads the light reflecting from the scene, the subject that you're photographing, and it runs it through an algorithm. And usually, at its most basic, what the camera is trying to do is render that reflected light that it's reading as being neutral. Not neutral in color, but neutral in tonality. So if, for example, you're photographing snow on a sunny day, you've got all this bright white snow, it's going to see that bright white. It's going to assume that it's not super bright white snow. It's going to assume that it's looking at something that's more neutral, and it's going to underexpose the image so the snow looks gray. Likewise, if you're photographing, for example, a black painted wall, it's going to do the opposite. It's going to assume that it's not black, and the camera is going to try to brighten that exposure to make it look more of this neutral, this average setting that it's usually aiming to do. Now, the camera meters have gotten a lot smarter in recent years. They're more equipped to properly take into account that there might be like a uniform monotone subject, and it's gotten a lot better in situations like photographing a black door or white snow. But still, you're going to have some challenges. So you're going to have to make adjustments to your exposure to make sure that you're getting the proper exposure value. And usually making those adjustments to your exposure is going to be enough, because the problem is, like when you're photographing the black dog, if you're not giving it the proper exposure, you're not really going to see a lot of detail in the fur of the dog. And if you get a proper exposure, then you're probably going to see that detail better. But that is also the other challenge when you're working with something like a black dog or white snowy scene on a bright sunny day, is there might not be a lot of detail or texture to begin with. So even if you get the proper exposure, you still might not get that texture that you really need to make the photograph stand out. So one thing you could think about doing when you're photographing that black dog is adding a little bit of fill flash to the equation. A little bit of light from flash at low power can just add a little bit of a highlight to parts of the fur that will bring out a little bit more detail and texture. So that's something that I recommend you think about doing. Of course, learning how to get the exposure right and learning how to get the flash exposure correct. These are things that are going to require a little bit of trial and error. It's not going to be something that happens automatically, but that is, I think, the direction you should be aiming for to make sure that those photographs look a lot better and that black dog subject stands out better.
Good answer. Very helpful. I have a black dog myself, so maybe I'll apply some of this if I get good enough. Rose has the next question.
Hi, Rose. Lots of ladies today.
Yeah, Rose says, hi, Ian.
It must be the awesome manly scar that I have.
They heard.
The ladies like it. Yes.
They knew the story was coming. Rose wants to know, do you ever travel without your camera?
Absolutely not.
Not even one time.
No, actually, usually the only reason I'm traveling is to do photography. I'm not really a vacation guy. I haven't taken a vacation literally since I became a professional photographer. Everything is a working vacation for me. My whole life is a vacation, as my wife likes to tell me. But no, I usually just, I'm almost always traveling with my camera. It's very rare that I'm not bringing my camera with me. So always have it with me because you never know what's going to happen.
Good advice. Jack has our next question. Thinking of all the photography gear that you own, is there anything you wish you hadn't bought and why?
Actually, I've got a bin of things that I wish I hadn't bought. They're up for sale if you're interested. I tend to experiment a lot with my gear, and I go through a lot of different things. And some things I find to be very useful right away. Other things I find to be less useful, and I end up selling those things. Sometimes it's lenses, like I don't know. I don't really have any particular examples. I can't say that there was anything that I bought that was just an utter disaster. I really can't think of anything offhand. But I tinker a lot with my gear. I think generally the advice I can give people when they're looking to buy gear is try to go light, try to minimize your gear. Having too much gear, you might think to yourself that you need lots of lenses and lots of gear because you never know what you might need to photograph. And it's true, if you don't have a lens that works for a particular subject and that subject happens to be there when you're out photographing, you're going to miss that shot. But having too much gear is going to weigh you down. It's going to slow you down. It is going to sap your creative energy. I've seen that a lot with people who have attended my workshops and tours. They come with like 50 pounds worth of camera gear, and they're tinkering with it forever, and it takes them forever to get set up, and they miss out on a lot of opportunities. So I do believe that keeping your gear kit lightweight and flexible so that you can optimize your energy for creativity is a very good idea.
All right. Moving right along then, Tom asks,
Tom.
How do you educate yourself to take better pictures?
So I'm completely self-taught. What's the word? Autodidact, I think.
Yeah,
yes.
I think so.
I self-taught myself that word, autodidact.
There's some great vocabulary in this Q&A if you want to go back and listen again. I love it.
If you're an autodidact about autodidactism, that begins to get very redundant. So I'm going to stop that right now. I'm completely self-taught, and I think most photographers are. And for me personally, the best way to learn was to think critically about the photographs I was making and the photographs I saw from other people. So whenever I would see something that I liked, whether it's something I took or someone else took, I wouldn't just be like, oh, hey, I like that. That's cool. I would think critically about why I liked it. I would think very hard about the reasons for the success or lack of success for a particular photograph or a piece of art I was looking at, a composition. And I think that going through that process is a very great way to successfully self-teach yourself photography. Of course, it doesn't hurt to have someone push you in the right direction. Obviously, a lot of people take photo workshops, and if you have the right instructor, they can really get you to think about composition, about artistic arrangement of visual elements, about the visual design of your photographs in a new way. So finding someone who has the vocabulary to discuss these concepts and to push you into thinking about things in a new way, that's always a good thing, definitely. And I think early on in my career, I sat down with a friend of mine who was more advanced as a photographer, and he became kind of my mentor. He was the one who pushed me to think more critically about things and to start thinking about the vocabulary of artistic expression, and this was very helpful for me early on.
Awesome. Lucas has a question.
Okay. Hello, Lucas.
Hey.
So it was all women, now it's all guys.
We're going back and forth. We'll see what happens on the next one. But Lucas needs help.
Okay.
I've been really frustrated lately that all my landscapes seem to have a crooked horizon. What am I doing wrong?
Well, what you're doing wrong is that you're not leveling your shots properly, or you're not doing anything wrong and your horizons are just naturally crooked. Okay, so there's a few ways you can make sure that your shots are level. The easiest way is these days most digital cameras actually have an artificial level that you can turn on, and you can position your camera until it is perfectly level. And that usually those artificial levels work really well. Another thing you can do is get one of those old bubble levels, and they make these little bubble level cubes that you could put into the hot shoe on the top of your camera where the flash normally goes. And these work pretty well. I don't think they're as accurate as the artificial levels that you get with the electronic levels with the cameras, because I have used bubble levels that are just off. You know, it's just something that has to be properly calibrated. So my experience is that the electronic levels are usually better. But sometimes you're photographing a scene where the horizon looks like it's tilted, and that may be natural. Like, you know, for years, photographers complained about the slope of the Grand Canyon because one side of the landscape was higher than the other. So you'd take a photograph, and it would look like the horizon was crooked, even though that's the natural horizon. And the other really bad example of this sort of thing is if you're photographing like on a lake or a pond, and the shoreline may be receding from you, and the shoreline as it's receding will actually look like a crooked horizon sometimes. So in situations where you have that naturally crooked horizon, that naturally appearing crooked horizon, you have to make a judgment call whether you want to straighten that horizon out when you're processing the file, or whether you want to retain that natural crookedness. Usually, my view is that people get wigged out by a crooked horizon, whether it's real or not. So I usually straighten the horizons no matter what. The only time you can't really do that when you have one of these naturally crooked appearing horizons is if you've got vertical elements like trees sticking up, because if you straighten the horizon, then the trees aren't going to be standing straight up, and it's going to be pretty obvious. So you just have to make your best judgment call when you're faced with these scenes or subjects where the horizon is naturally crooked. But it really helps to use a tripod to make sure you've got a level shot. I think the times that people end up with crooked horizons more often than not are when they're hand-holding, which I think when you're shooting landscapes is not a good idea anyways. I'm a big proponent of using a tripod to get maximum stability and to fine-tune your composition. Also, it's when people are trying to eyeball the horizon. They're just looking at it through their viewfinder or on their screen, thinking to themselves, oh, that looks crooked. When you do that, that's a recipe for disaster. So use the electronic level on your camera or a bubble level. You'll get much more accurate results.
Okay, we are swinging back around. Angie's got a question.
Okay. Hi, Angie.
Hi, Angie. Angie's looking for tips for newbies to astrophotography, especially setting focus in the dark.
Well, so this is not really my forte. I'm not an astrophotographer. Usually setting focus in the dark, the best thing you can do is to manually set your focus to the infinity point, the infinity marker on your lens. But that's not always going to be accurate because the infinity point may actually change as the elements of your lens grow hotter or colder in the temperature. So that's why with most lenses you can focus beyond infinity, which I know is a mind-boggling concept. There's no way to go beyond infinity, to infinity and beyond. But you can actually focus past the infinity point because these lens materials will change their size as they expand or contract with temperature changes. So, the infinity point doesn't always work. So often, you're trying to focus on the sky. And so what I will sometimes do if I'm trying to do like a nightscape shot or something like that is I'll look for maybe the moon is in the sky or there's a particularly bright and big star, and I'll try to focus on that. And that's usually the best thing you can do. But as I said, I'm not an astrophotographer. This is not my area of expertise. So unfortunately, I don't have a better answer than that. Sorry.
That's a good start. We've got our next question from Al.
Hello, Al.
So Al is asking, do you use the camera that comes with the drone or do you change it out?
Yeah, I use the camera that comes with the drone. There's really no way of changing it out. So most drones will have a fixed camera that you have to use. You could, in theory, use a different camera, but the problem is if you can actually put the camera, like me, I don't know, maybe like a GoPro, you can stick it on your drone or something like that. You can easily enough stick it on, but controlling the camera is the difficult part. So you're probably not going to have like an app on your phone that allows you to communicate with the GoPro when it's several hundred feet away, and there's no way you can change your position or any of your settings easily either. So the camera on the drone is more often than not the best way to go.
I think we've got time for a few more questions.
right.
So we're going to start
Suck
getting
'em to me.
close to the end.
Hit me with some good questions the way that a drone blade hit my face.
Oh, well, let's start with this one.
All right.
This is coming from a guest.
Ooh.
So someone out there.
Someone who prefers to remain anonymous.
Awesome t-shirt you are wearing, Ian.
Thank you. It's an orangutan.
Where can we order those? It says Conrad from Las Vegas
Well,
right at the end.
Okay, Conrad. This is an orangutan t-shirt that I purchased when I was photographing orangutans in Indonesia. So I'm not sure. There's some information on the back. I think this was a orangutan conservation organization.
SumatraNorangutan.org.
Yep. SumatraNorangutan.org is where you could possibly get this awesome orangutan t-shirt.
Yes.
Great question.
All right, we have another guest asking, what time of the day did you take the photos in Greenland?
So I took the photos at sunrise, sunset. It was the same time of day, and it lasted for about 5 or 6 hours every night because the sun never really set, or if it did set, it just barely set. So it was always basically sometime between 11 p.m. and like 4 or 5 a.m. So you get this 6-hour period where you would get this mix of golden hour light and then magic hour twilight light. So it basically lasted most of the night. So I actually never left my Minneapolis time zone. I flew to Greenland, and because I was staying up all throughout the night, by the time I was getting to sleep, it was actually close to like, I don't know, sometimes midnight or 2 a.m. On local Minneapolis time. So I would have to go back to my hotel room, pull down the shades really tight, put on a blindfold, put in earplugs, and then just sleep as much as I could.
All right, I think we're going to finish up with one last question.
All right.
Could be a good opportunity here. Guest is asking. We got lots of guest
Hello,
questions at the end.
guest. I'm going to be really embarrassed if his name is actually Guest. So,
Specifically, guest 3852.
well, hello, Guest 3852.
I know it is a complicated topic, but what advice can you give on proper focusing for landscape photography?
Oh, this isn't a real question. This is coming from the control booth. Every episode we get questions about focusing for landscape photography, and every episode I scold the control booth for not having a graphic of my course, Focusing for Landscape Photography, ebook and video, which is available on the OPG shop. So make sure to check that out because the control booth is ready this time.
Look at that.
No, they're shaking their heads. They're claiming it wasn't them. So this is a real question coming from someone whose real name is Guest 3852.
But I figured it was a fabulous opportunity and a great way to close it out.
It is, in fact, a very complicated area. I could talk about it for hours, and I do in Focusing for Landscape Photography, an ebook and video course. So check it out. I think you'll find it to be very helpful.
Yes, what an amazing finish. That was a really nice one to end on.
Yes, that was fantastic.
Just a reminder to follow us on social media. That's Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and Twitter. We have that free digital download. You can click on the link in the description or the banner. 7 ways to immediately improve your photography by photographer David Johnston. And I'll let Ian wrap it up from here.
Thank you once again for joining us for this exciting episode of OPG Live, and thank you to our sponsor Tamron for making this event possible. Just remember, OPG Live, it's more fun than getting a drone attack to the face. So tune in next time for our next really exciting episode of OPG. I can't even talk anymore because I'm laughing so much. OPG Live. I'm professional photographer Ian Plant.
I'm Leah Zahner.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.